各位弟兄姐妹们平安，请大家预备心，开始今天国语堂的崇拜。宣召，你们要赞美耶和华，在神的圣所赞美他，在他显能力的穹苍赞美他。凡有气息的都要赞美耶和华。你们要赞美耶和华。让我们一起同心来祷告。慈爱的天父，我们存着谦卑和敬畏的心来到你施恩宝座前，用心灵诚实敬拜赞美你。你配得一切荣耀尊贵，万膝要向你跪拜，万口要向你承认。因主，你是赐生命的主宰，也是万福的泉源。主，感谢你在万民当中拣选了我们，赐给我们永生的生命和永远的盼望。如今活着，不再是我，乃是基督在我们里面活着。所以我们要凡事都尊主为大，让主在我们的人生中掌权，居首位。主啊，愿你与我们同在，让我们脱去从前的旧人，心意能够天天被主所更新，在基督里做新造的人。愿主分别为圣，做我们随时的帮助。谢谢你在疫情当中保守了弟兄姐妹的平安，但这场疫情仍然在全世界肆虐，有2200万的人感染，70多万人的死亡。我们求神护庇着医护人员，并赐给医学专家聪明智慧，使得医药及疫苗能及早发明出来。恳求你用大能的手拯救这地和你的百姓。今天我们也要为这世界的和平安定祈求。主啊，求你赐给执政掌权的都有敬畏你的心，能为世界的和谐、万民的福祉着想。求神帮助我们，遇试探时不至于灰心失望，因你四下盼望。当我们或有烦恼愁苦，或有挂虑重担，或有忧愁软弱不堪时，我们都可以带到主恩座前求。因你爱我们，是我们的山寨、避难所，在你怀中闭蒙护佑。求你的话语开启我们属灵的悟性，帮助我们更多的认识你，经历你。请将我们藏在你恩典的翅膀下，应许我们的祷告，一生安稳在你手中。教会的各样事工都恭恭敬敬地仰望你。疫情当中，人能同心合意，使福音兴旺，带领人知道你的救恩。求神看顾身体心灵软弱的弟兄姐妹，保守大家平安健康。今天的崇拜从头到末了都恭敬地交在你的手中，透过讲坛的信息，使我们的灵命得到造就与成长。救恩、荣耀、颂赞、全能都归于你，直到永永远远。恭敬祷告，是奉主耶稣基督的圣名，阿们。
耶和华，你是我的神，我要时时称颂你的名。你是我的盾牌，是我的荣耀，又是叫我抬起头的神。 然仇敌围绕攻击我，在你怀中必不怕遭害。你是我的神，我所依靠的，你同在是我全然的神。是我全然的神。
这世间有个千年不变道理，那就是耶稣爱你。在世上没有任何的逼迫患难能使我们与神的爱隔绝。你是否愿意同为神的儿女，一生让耶稣爱你？在世上没有任何的困苦愁烦能使我们与神的爱隔绝。
世上没有任何的困苦愁烦 这世界有个千年不变道理，那就是耶稣爱你。在世上没有任何的逼迫患难能使我们与神的爱隔绝。你是否愿意同为神的儿女，一生让耶稣爱你？在世上没有任何的困苦愁烦能使我们与神的爱隔
绝。在世上没有任何的困苦愁烦能使我们与神的爱隔绝。
我们一起来为我们的孩子们祷告。亲爱的主，我们感谢你，在这段疫情的期间，你仍然保守着每一个孩子都如此的健康。感谢你用天使天军在他们的周围保守他们，也带领他们没有受到疫情的影响。亲爱的主，求你保守这些孩子们，主要在这个变幻的世界当中，主仍然带领他们，仍然预备他们，主啊，以后成为你所使用的器皿。主，求主你帮助父母能够在这段期间里面造就我们的孩子，培养我们的孩子，按照你的教训和警戒的养育我们的孩子，使我们的孩子以后成为主手中合用的器皿。主，谢谢你，恳求你给父母智慧，给父母恩典，给父母健康。主啊，你祝福父母，也让父母把他的祝福留在孩子的身上。感谢主，亲爱的主，谢谢你，求主你不断的保守我们的孩子，他们的一生都走在当走的道路上，一生都不偏离。谢谢主，我们将祷告感谢，奉耶稣基督圣名，阿们。
今天的经节记载在哥林多前书1章18节到2章5节。因为十字架的道理在那灭亡的人为愚拙，在我们得救的人却为神的大能。就如经上所记，我要灭绝智慧人的智慧，废弃聪明人的聪明。智慧人在哪里？文士在那里。这世上的辩士在那里？神岂不是叫这世上的智慧变成愚拙吗？世人凭自己的智慧，既不认识神，神就乐意用人所当所愚拙的道理，拯救那些信的人。这就是神的智慧了。犹太人是要神机，希利尼人是求智慧，我们却是传钉十字架的基督，在犹太人为绊脚石，在外邦人为愚拙。但在那蒙召的，无论是犹太人、希利尼人，基督总为神的能力，神的智慧。因神的愚拙总比人智慧，神的软弱总比人强壮。弟兄们哪，可见你们蒙召的，按着肉体有智慧的不多，有能力的不多，有尊贵的也不多。神却拣选了世上愚拙的，叫有智慧的羞愧；又拣选了世上软弱的，叫那强壮的羞愧。神也拣选了世上卑贱的、被人厌恶的，以及那无有的，为要废掉那有的，使一切有血气的，在神面前一个也不能自夸。但你们得在基督耶稣里是本乎神，神又使他成为我们的智慧、公义、圣洁、救赎。如经上所记，夸口的 当指着主夸口，弟兄们，从前我到你们那里去，并没有用高言大志对你们宣传神的奥秘，因为我曾定了主意，在你们中间不知道别的，只知道耶稣基督，并他钉十字架。我在你们那里又软弱又惧怕，又甚战惊。我说的话讲的道，不是用智慧委婉的言语，乃是用圣灵和大能的明证，叫你们的信不在乎人的智慧，只在乎神的大能。以上是神的话。
I wonder if you can remember a time where you planned and prepared for something to happen, but circumstances changed and everything you had anticipated was now different and you were left feeling like an unprepared fool. That's been my week this week. Because this talk needs to be translated with subtitles added, my plan was to have everything done well in advance to make it easier for the team doing it. But my week of preparation did not turn out as I expected. There were interruptions and other things that I had to attend to, which squeezed out the time and my mental space to be able to concentrate. But the bigger issue was that as I looked at this passage, I just got lost in its beauty and wonder. There is so much here for us to receive, but what should I choose? Normally I'm happy just to read and write and think and then get up and say whatever comes out at the time, but that's not very helpful for those who need a written manuscript to work on. I didn't want to give them a similar experience of having their week not going to plan. Technical issues have also meant I'm recording this over again, which has caused further delay. Things in life often don't go as we anticipate. We simply need to adapt and do our best in those circumstances. I'm sure you can think of times this has happened to you and for our church. Today we are having our annual church partnership meeting, where we look back with thanks and forwards in anticipation for all that God is doing amongst us as His people. Ordinarily, we would also come together in a combined service of celebration and then share a meal together to strengthen our fellowship by spending time with one another. Coronavirus has obviously made a huge change to that, and so we have to simply adapt. So for the first time in our history, we'll have our annual meeting online. And that's okay, because we can still do what we need to do. More significantly though, is that we will be scattered in small groups in homes and here at different times, unable to come together as one united people. Again, it's not a major problem, although it's disappointing and frustrating. However, it does have some potential dangers. As we live in this prolonged circumstance of being unable to get together, there is a real possibility that some people might feel isolated, or break off from others, or start to look only internally to their smaller grouping, rather than having a sense of us being a much larger community together. Just these types of things happened to Paul. Paul went to the Greek city of Corinth and planted a new Christian community, and after some 18 months or so of living alongside of them, moved on to continue his work of mission elsewhere. But things didn't go as he anticipated, even though he'd worked so hard amongst them. Paul was incredibly discouraged to hear that instead of being united and growing together in love and peace, they'd fragmented into smaller groups, competing with each other and criticising one another, picking favourites as leaders whom they gave disproportionate adulation, and labelling others as lesser spiritual beings whom they undeservedly disparaged without concern for its impact. So he writes to them with a pained heart to express his hope that they would change and head in a better direction. His message is incredibly relevant to us today. The things that Paul teaches here are so totally revolutionary in their ideas that even if we can grasp them intellectually, actually letting them shape our living is a lifelong journey of transformation, bringing a whole new mindset, new feelings, new aspirations and new values. And this is where we'll go today. One word that Paul uses to try and help people to follow Jesus faithfully in their context is wisdom. Wisdom is a word that dominates the first 3 chapters of this letter. In fact, Paul uses this word wisdom, Lady Sophia in Greek, 3 times more in these chapters than he does in all the rest of his other epistles combined. He does that not just because it's what they needed, but because it's what they most misunderstood. The Corinthians were captivated by the idea of wisdom. They gave adulation to a travelling troupe of speakers and talkers and philosophers who presented their ideas to win favour and esteem for themselves and to sway the crowds through their great speeches and oratory. What they loved was how impressive and persuasive a speaker could be, for this in their minds was a display of power, thinking that if a person can say great things, they must also be great. Whether or not the content of what they actually said was true wasn't nearly as important. They would gladly run after those speakers and stand to listen for 3 or 4 hours at a time as the eloquent displayed their mastery and enthralled them with their rhetoric. Even their athletic contests had speaking competitions as part of the games. Wisdom, and so power, was about how well you spoke. These Corinthians, who were now part of the church, hung on to this prizing of wisdom, but the tragedy was their understanding of wisdom had not changed when they came to faith in Jesus. Paul teaches here that God's wisdom is actually the very opposite of what we would expect wise living to be, and so unnatural to the ways of the world that it causes direct conflict with it. This is not because the world is stupid or has nothing to teach us, but because its core underlying values are not aligned with God's. The world teaches us the wise person is the one who knows how to control themselves and master their circumstances so that they live well. Wisdom then is an exercise of power. This is true in many ways, for there is power in wisdom. But the power the world teaches us to seek by wisdom is the very opposite to God's practice of power. He seeks to achieve something very different by his wisdom and power, and so it doesn't fit within the pattern of how we believe the world should be. In this way, Paul is most like Jesus, whom he follows, who in his teaching describes his upside-down kingdom values, where the poor are rich and the persecuted happy. The blessedness Jesus invites us to receive in such places as the Sermon on the Mount is like it's a photographic negative to what we expect. Look at what Paul teaches here. Firstly, he says, God's wisdom is exercised through the power of the cross. This is foolishness, weakness, and shamefulness in the view of the world, but it is God's deepest wisdom. Suffering defeat on the cross is the way that God will triumphantly and finally bring about order and healing to the world's disorder and decay. The death of Jesus on the cross is the way he brings his salvation to the world, and those who are being saved put their hope in the Lord who is rejected and murdered in disgrace as a victim to hostile powers. God's way of exercising power is not focused on himself, but doing good to others. Because he loves us, he is willing to literally bear the costs of our sin and shame in himself, rather than let us carry it. This is the heart of God whom we have come to know, who embraces us in weakness and love. Even though he is the sovereign and almighty one, he is also most frighteningly a God of weakness and gentleness, who makes peace. Here is the very foundation of Christian life. God comes to us on a cross, and we must take up our own cross and live like the crucified Jesus with one another. This is part of Paul's answer to the factions and fighting that is taking place in Corinth as they use their misplaced values to compete with one another. Hear what he says in verses 18 to 25. For the mystery of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Greeks. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. God's wisdom is all about upside-down power. This is how God overturns rebellion and power and hubris. He rescues us by being lost himself. He reconciles us by being forsaken. He heals us by taking our sicknesses and our death into himself. He makes us righteous by becoming sin. He glorifies us by his own shame. Notice that Paul is specific here. He does not just speak of the death of Christ as he does elsewhere in his letters, but very pointedly directs us to the crucifixion of Jesus. He does this deliberately because it's only this which communicates the point he wants to make. If all that mattered in God's way of bringing salvation was that Jesus died for us, he could just have equally been stoned to death by the Jews or killed by a Roman sword or spear. But Paul says there is significance in the act of crucifixion, which was the most bloody and torturous means that people had conceived of to humiliate and ridicule someone they despised. We've got so used to the idea of a cross that it fails to shock us. We wear them around our necks and we put them on our letterheads and on neon signs upon our tallest buildings. The cross has become a neat, clean, distinctive logo which would make any marketing guru proud. But in the ancient world, where people were acquainted with real crucifixions, the cross was the most repulsive and disgusting image you can imagine, even though it was such a notorious and emblematic display of Roman power. Cicero thought it was so unspeakably ugly that it should be off limits in polite conversation. He wrote, the very word cross should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes and ears. To have it as the foundation of your message was repulsive and shocking. Something like saying that the very most important action of God in the world was what happened in the gas chambers or the killing fields. It is a barbaric and disgusting idea. Would we want to paint frescoes of mass graves across our chapel ceilings or have a sculpture of a gas chamber in our kitchens? That's grotesque, but it's what we do with the cross. Earlier this year I visited the Palatine Hill in Rome. On one of its walls there is some ancient graffiti from the 3rd century showing how common people understood crucifixion. There is a picture of a young boy called Alexamenos who is drawn like a stupid looking Bart Simpson. He looks up at a figure and the text says, Alexamenos worships his God. And how is this God drawn? Here is a man on a cross, but he has the head of an ass, a stupid donkey, showing how foolish and stupid, indeed utterly ridiculous it is to think that such a disgraceful thing warrants any affection or attention. So when Paul preaches that God has come in power in the person of Jesus to bring his kingdom, and that story culminates in his rejection and torture to death, naked and ashamed and brutalized on a cross, this does not fit at all with how anyone else would think of God's wisdom being displayed. It is foolishness to Gentiles and a stumbling block to Jews. For which Jew, hoping for the liberation and restoration of Israel, would follow a king who was defeated and put to shame under the sign their law taught was being cursed by the community and displayed as such by being hung on a tree. Paul says the message of the cross does not fit at all with talk by the wise Greek philosophers or the learned instructions of Jewish scribes who taught the law, or those clever performing storytellers, those sophists who spouted forth in the public squares. It is not surprising that both Jews and Gentiles would find the proclamation of the cross grossly offensive. But Paul's great fear here is that even some Christians in Corinth have tried to move on beyond the centrality of the cross, perhaps to a more spirit-centred or triumphalist religion. So we ask ourselves, are we living by this wisdom and letting the power of God shape us in how we relate with others? We will know we are to the extent that when other people look at us, What they see is the image of our character coming to resemble in their minds Christ crucified. This characterises how we relate to others and allows unity and love to grow. So secondly, Paul says God's wisdom overturns status. Christ the servant died the death reserved for slaves and foreign terrorists. No Roman citizen could suffer crucifixion except for the direct decree of Caesar. The cross was the culmination of Jesus' life in which he always took the low place to promote others rather than seeking to lord it over other people and impress them or control them by the power of his person. Paul says to the Corinthians, look at yourselves and see God's way in the world and what he thinks about people. Recognise that it's not the strong and powerful and the noble that he regards and calls, and nor should we value these things as more significant in our community than a person's Christ-likeness. The remarkable sociology of the early church, which made it incredibly countercultural and striking, was that nowhere else in the ancient world did such mixed groups of differing status gather together in unity. Clubs and associations drew like-minded people from similarly placed social circles. But in the church, a slave could be a leader to a noble, and a woman a teacher of men, and a child an example to imitate for all adults. For we are all equal and one at the foot of the cross. Division in the church is a contradiction of Christ crucified. We must remember this every time we are tempted to have a go at one of our brothers or sisters and to push them down in judgment. Hear Paul's words, for they are true for us too. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is, our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Christ was crucified for everyone, the high and low, brilliant and buffoon, and so this unites us as the only wisdom and power we trust and give allegiance to. He alone is the one who makes us right before God. He is our righteousness, not anything we do or are. He alone sets us apart to serve God. He is our holiness. He alone has paid to set us free and make us his own possession. He is our redemption. So Paul therefore asks them, why are you now looking up to those who seem impressive on the outside, whether or not they're impressive on the inside? Boast about Christ, not other people or yourself, based on superficial and passing things. In the books of Romans and Galatians, Paul challenged divisions between Jews and Gentiles, insisting that no ethnic and cultural differences ought to divide the church. In Corinth, he is challenging divisions of class, status, and education. Who do we exalt and fawn after? And who do we push down or neglect? Sometimes we might think, if we could just get so-and-so who's an influential person to believe, imagine how this would improve our image and spread the faith. We invite celebrity evangelists as guest speakers to talk at an event. It's because of their fame, not because of their ability to communicate the faith clearly. This was what was happening in Corinth. As Luke writes in Acts, chapter 18, 24-28, Apollos was schooled in Alexandrine rhetoric, and so was a brilliant and charismatic speaker. Therefore, people regarded him as wise and powerful. But impressive eloquence is not what we should regard. Note well, it's not Apollos' fault here. He'd done nothing wrong, and nowhere does Paul criticise him. Rather, it's what other people have made him to be. Which leads to my third and final point. God's wisdom means communicating his mystery in a way where the form of our speech and conduct is consistent with its content. This is how Paul demonstrates the power of the cross. His confidence is not in his eloquence to persuade, the power of his speaking. Instead, its power is seen when someone receives his message and it transforms their life so that they become Christ-like or Christ on the cross-like person. Listen to how Paul reminds them of how he modelled this when he was with them. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. It's interesting that the thing which is doing most damage to divide the church is not theological heresy, but an improper congregational understanding of preaching. They were attracted to their leaders on the basis of their ability to preach eloquently and powerfully, which was credited as wisdom. Paul isn't saying he doesn't speak clearly or carefully, but rather his confidence isn't in his oratory, but the message itself. Nor is he saying that every message he speaks is about the atonement and nothing else. Rather, all he says and how he says it point consistently to this mysterious wisdom of God who works in power by weakness and love. Everything Paul says and does is measured by its conformity to the cross. And later on in this letter, he'll say conformity to the resurrection. Here, he reminds them that his confidence wasn't in his powerful speaking. In fact, he was worried and anxious because he knew in advance what reception such a message would receive in Corinth. So they should not now run after or divide over who they think sounds the best. The gospel's true power is seen in the transformation it makes in human lives, so that those jostling for power and glory and status now become humble servants in imitation of their master. If this is true power and wisdom, then we ask, who has influence and power in our church? Who do we listen to and why? Why do we give status and who do we give it to in the world? Paul would be horrified to hear how we talk about people being powerful preachers with some special anointing or other such phrase. So this makes the preacher's church popular, or their podcasts like, or their conferences full of paying customers. What about our relationships? Who will have power in our church meeting? Who has status and impresses by speaking well? Is it the rich person who supports the church financially and so we must keep them on side? Or is it the one whose life looks most like a crucifixion? This is where true power and boasting should be as we esteem others rightly. And it is these which make a difference in the world and bring glory to God. One of the other things which didn't go as expected for me this week was negotiating with a series of workmen coming to our home. We have a stormwater pipe that runs down an easement on the side of our property, and to make a long story short, I've been fighting with council to try and get them to come and fix it. It's corroded, and in times of storm we get waterfalls of water rushing through our yard and flooding our house. After many months, things are finally underway this week. Some contractors came to clear all the trees that were growing along the line of the pipe so that it could be dug up and a new one laid. Two men came to our house. There was a young Lebanese bloke who was wielding the chainsaw as the boss, and a strapping young African man who was the labourer. For some reason, the council had given them the wrong address, and so the guy in charge of the project called me up, and I had to rush home and meet these guys in front of my house so that they cut down the right trees. You can imagine what my neighbours would have felt if they did the wrong place. Anyway, as I made small talk, they told me that it was this young African man's first day on the job. Both he and the Lebanese guy spoke with thick accents. So as these two men talked together, there was much misunderstanding between them. And so I started to say to the African guy what his boss was telling him to do. Then as he got to work, I noticed that he had no hat and no drink, and he was soon in a lather of sweat. So I went inside and brought them out both some drinks. Then I watched him grappling with the branches that his boss had cut down, dragging them up to the curb to be thrown into the machine to make them into wood chips. He had no gloves, and I could see his hands were getting sore. So I went and got mine and gave them to him. He looked at me sheepishly, but I said, "You have them and you keep them, because I know you were going on to another job after this." As we were talking there were some heavy branches that he was struggling to pull up on his own, so I began to help him. And after a while, I stood up on the curb and he passed them up to me and I pulled them up. And so it was that we began to work together. And about 4 hours later, the job was done. I was tired and sore, but it was good fun. But the day I had planned to write my sermon was now gone. I did these things without thinking. It just seemed the right thing to do. My instinct was not to say, "I'm paying you for this work and this menial task is below me and I have far more lofty and important things to do." It just seemed right to help, even though it came at a cost for my own week. Now, I want you to know, in no way was I thinking that I was making any point or trying to manufacture an opportunity to say, "I'm behaving this way because I'm a Christian." I was just very happy to show care and let them get on their way to their next job. But for some reason, this young Lebanese guy came and asked me in a surprised voice, "Who are you and what do you do?" I told him, "Well, I'm a pastor in a church." He said, "Okay." Then he asked me, "Which one?" And then as an afterthought, he asked, "Does your church need any mulch? Because I have some that's really cheap." This was all we said between us on that topic. But it seems he went on and talked to others connected to the project, because every worker that has come onto my property since has wanted to talk to me about religion. Most have been Muslims and want to talk to me about Jesus. To a man, they have been warm and friendly to me, and we've had some really good conversations. My point is this: we want to be people shaped by the cross. This must be seen in how we live with each other, in our church family. It must be seen because this is how God's power is displayed in the world, so that others also come to enjoy this wonderful salvation. And living this way with each other means church is like a schoolroom where we learn to live this way so that we can go out and live it that way in the world, just as Jesus lived in the world. This is the wisdom we need. This is how we negotiate all the changes and frustrations of life, both as individuals and as a church. This is the wisdom the generations of our church before us have lived by, and this is what we hope our children and grandchildren will grasp as they watch us live with them. Friends, let's live by Christ on the cross, for here is wisdom to live well today. May God help us to do so that we can boast in him and give him all the glory, for truly he is good.
主耶稣，我感谢你，你的身体为我而生，带我出黑暗，进入光明国度，使我再次能看见主耶稣。感谢你，你的宝血为我而流，宝贵是加上医治恩典永留，使我完全的
贵是这的大能赐我生命。主耶稣，我夫妇敬拜你。宝贵是这的救恩，是你所立的约，你的爱永远不会改变。
主耶稣，我感谢你，你的身体为我而生，带我出黑暗，进入光明国度，使我再次能看见。主耶稣，感谢你，你的宝血为我而流，宝贵是加上一直恩典永留，使我完全的自由。
宝贵是加的大能赐我生命。主耶稣，我夫妇敬拜你。宝贵是加的救恩，是你所立的约，你的爱永远不会改变。宝贵是加的大能赐我生命。主耶稣，是加的救恩，是你所立的约，你的爱永远不会改变。宝贵是这的大能赐我生命。主耶稣，我夫妇敬拜你。宝贵是加的救恩，是你所立的约，你的爱
不改变。你的爱永不改变。
让我们一同来接受上帝从天上来的祝福。愿我主耶稣基督的恩惠、天父上帝的慈爱、圣灵的感动与交通，常与你们众人同在，从今时直到永永远远。阿们。